Welcome back. In this video, let's take a look at Eclipse and talk about how to debug code. So here's my Eclipse. Maximize it. And sometimes when we are having issues with our code, it's too hard to guess where the issue is. And doing what we call stepping through the code helps you see what the code is doing line by line. So this is called debugging, and we're going to do it to this program. Now, first, real quick, let's talk about what this program's doing. In this program, we have an integer that is part of this loop, and as we loop through each time 1 through 10, we're squaring the integer and then printing that out. We also are using the square int, which is a method outside of our main method that actually does the squaring for us. All it does is take the incoming number and times it by itself, which produces the square and returns the square. So when we run this program, we simply see down here that it works exactly as we would expect. 2 squared equals 4, so forth and so on. Now let's take a look at what that looks like when we debug it. Now when we start this into debug mode, it's going to ask us if we want to go into what's known as debug perspective. And we do. It does make things a little bit easier when you're debugging. You're going to see the pieces that help you debug. Before we do that, let's set up what's known as a breakpoint right here in this method. Now you can click out here in the left column by the number. If you double click, you'll see that little blue dot. That indicates that a breakpoint has occurred. You can also right click and say toggle breakpoint. Now with that being said, we can come up here and we can come down here to debug as, and we're going to debug this Java application. This is where it's going to ask us about changing to that perspective. I go ahead and say, remember my decision, and say yes. And a little bit about the screen. Now we can see our code down here in this neat little window. This window up here is what's known as our thread stack. And our window over here is going to show variables. Now we can add variables to look at, or it's also going to show us variables that are close to where we're at in the code. Now, since we started debugging, it went ahead and jumped into this code and stopped at our breakpoint. Now we can hold our cursor over a variable, in which case it will pop out and show us what's stored in that variable currently. Now that the green line is on this particular line, it means that it has not ran this line yet, that it's sitting right before that line ready to run it. So if we hold it over result, because we haven't ran this function yet, we haven't ran this line, you can see nothing is stored in the result. So let's go ahead and look at these different debug functions. We can step into, step over, and step return within your debug. When you step over, it means that it's going to run that line of code. However, if that line of code were to dive into another function, it won't dive into that function. It will go ahead and run that function and then come back and run the next line of code in this function. Step into does just the opposite. If you're on a line of code that would step into another function, it's going to actually step into that function so you can go through it. In this case, because we're on this green line, there's nothing to step into. So if we use the step in, it doesn't really step into anything. It just runs the line of code. And now if we put our cursor over result, we can see that result has a number. We can also see up here the variable result has 1. Let's continue doing this. Now the green line has come out of this function and back up into this function, which is our main, our public static void main, and it's inside our for loop. And as you can see, square hasn't been set yet because we stepped into this, but this line hasn't been actually executed yet. So let's step one more. And now square should be set. We'll go ahead and say step into. It's going to do our console output. If we step into again, you can see that it's updated I to 2. And here's where, like I said, if you step in, it's going to dive into this function, which is right here. So let's do that. As you can see, the cursor went down here, and now this line is green. If we continue, we're going to see some variables change over here. Result is now 4, and so we should return 4. If we keep going, we're going to see our square is now 4 again, and we're going to print out the results. Now we're back at the top of the for loop. Now instead of doing the step in, I'm just going to do the step over. And notice that we don't go into the function. Oh, I'm wrong. We did go into the function because we still have a breakpoint set here. So the breakpoint is overriding the fact that we used the step over because it has to stop at this line because we have a breakpoint. So let's go ahead and finish stepping through. So far, so good. Now this time, while we're still in debug, let's take off that breakpoint so it won't stop it. And let's do the step over. And as you can see, square was updated because it went down in here. It ran this function, returned the square, and because we did step over, it did all that without stepping into the function. So this is a good way to look at your code and run it line by line or as you need to and see the variables changing in real time. I hope this helps you. If you get stuck on an assignment and things aren't coming out the way they're supposed to be doing, I definitely highly recommend starting here with the debug and stepping through your code to see where your code may be going wrong. All right, well, have a great time, and we'll see you in the next video.